Hello, and I'm really excited that we have Dave Morris here, who is a writer extraordinaire in the game book world. And not just game books, actually. You've done a lot of sort of role-playing books as well, and adaptations and
comics.
Comics.
Yes.
I can read a list if you want. I can do it, and we can just to give the viewers an idea of how much you've done. The Bloodsword series, the Chronicles of the Magi. Crystal Maze, Dragon Warrior series, the Fable Land series, Fighting Fantasy series 1 there, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Keeper of the Lich Lord. The Golden Dragon series, the Hero Chris series, Nightmare series, the Teenage Ninja Mutant series, Turtle series, Virtual Reality series, and, well, Wikipedia says other works. So, but...
Thunderbirds as well. I don't know if you mentioned Thunderbirds.
No.
In fact, I did all the Jerry Andersons.
Wow.
Which was rather fun because I loved them obviously as a kid, and then the publishers got the rights to do the books. So I had to watch all the old episodes, and I could pick the stories I wanted to tell. And I had my old annuals from when I was a kid that had the cutaways of things like Stingray and Thunderbird 2 and so on. I gave them to the publisher and I said, kids will love these cutaways. So they took those. They didn't have the originals, but they had those and they redrew them. So yeah, anyway, I've done all sorts of stuff.
Well, I'm going to take you back to the very, very beginning, and we'll see where you kind of come from and how you kind of got into writing game books, and a little bit about your career and where you are now.
Mm-hmm.
So take us back to when you kind of started. What did you study? You went to Oxford, is that correct?
Yes, but I did physics there, so I don't know how relevant that was to the whole game book process. But I suppose, like a lot of, I was going to become a postgrad, but the postgrad options I was given weren't the ones that interested me. So I drifted out of that academic sphere, and I'd actually had published a role-playing game just after leaving college called Mortal Kombat. This was 1979.
Wow. And
the chaps at Games Workshop had seen it and wanted me to design them a GW, a UK role-playing game. I think they had in mind that they wouldn't keep Dungeons & Dragons license forever, so they needed a substitute. But in fact, they then got the RuneQuest license, so they lost interest. But I'd started thinking about a role-playing game of my own. And then Jamie Thompson, who I knew just through mutual friends, actually got a job at Games Workshop. So it kind of pulled me back into their orbit at that stage. And I started writing lots of articles for White Dwarf just because he would often say, I've got 4 pages to fill by Saturday. And I didn't mind taking whatever scenario I was running in my own games at the time and quickly turning it into something.
So I'm going to drill you back down in university. Is that when you first started gaming? And
no, I actually started. I think it was either at school or just after leaving school. I remember we went and bought a game. A whole bunch of us used to meet at the sixth form common room on a Saturday morning in Guildford, and we would play various war games. And we went up to town together quite often, and we found this thing, Empire of the Petal Throne, and we had to chip in together because it was quite expensive. It was sort of 25 quid. So we each put in a £5. And then we were sitting on the train coming home and looking at it thinking, wait a minute, what is it? Because we were just impressed by the map. It was a hex grid map. So we thought, oh, we'll have loads of battles of kingdoms. And then we realized, well, you only play one character at a time, which seems ridiculous then, but we thought we'd give it a go. And that's what pulled me into role-playing. So that would have been either just after leaving school or whilst just at the end of my sixth form.
Did you carry on role playing when you were at university? Did you have time?
Yeah, at first I thought it was so connected to the circle of friends I had that I didn't really and when you're first at college you got other things to think about. But I think one evening I happened to be mentioning it to some people I knew, and they said it sounds fun. So I managed to dig out my copy of the rules and started having a game. And yeah, we got to the point where we would be playing, I was doing more gaming probably than work on my degree,
Yeah.
at least in the second year. Maybe I may buckle down a little bit better in the third year.
And can you remember the first sort of scenario that you wrote? You know, I'm just thinking when you, I do believe that a lot of people end up doing what they were passionate about when they were sort of children and sort of teenagers. And that kind of hooks in.
Yeah, I don't think I ever wrote a scenario until White Dwarf, when they actually started asking for them. I mean, the idea, because we didn't play like that, you know, it was very improv. So I would have a bit of an idea or half an idea, and I deliberately didn't really want to overwork it, because that would force the story in a particular direction, and that wasn't the way we used to game. So I would usually have a kind of, a toolbox of a few, these would be cool settings if the player characters end up there. But we would round robin who was running the game. So it was just a developing kind of improv soap opera, I think. And the idea of actually writing up a scenario didn't occur. You know, it was just about half a page of notes, basically. It was, and after the game, it was, you know, those mandalas that Tibetan monks make. The point was to participate, not to end up with an artwork. So we would blow the sand away, metaphorically, and move on to the next mandala.
Were you very much into the game mechanics? Was that something that interested you at the time? Because obviously,
I suppose a little bit. Although that was probably, you know, I mean, because obviously doing physics, you do a lot of maths, and so I would be interested in things like statistical distributions and that kind of thing. But I think it's actually because I always had you know, a kind of pull between physics or English as the two routes I might have gone, I suppose, to college. And so really it was the performance and the story and the emergent stories are what interested me, I suppose, that you would sit down without really a plan and a story would come together like in life. And so it was really, I suppose there's a degree of kind of scientific interest there, but it's mostly narrative interest, I think.
No, that's interesting. And did you sort of read a lot of sort of fantasy books at university and school, or is that?
I certainly had done when I was a teenager. Sometimes there's a podcast I listen to, the Appendix N book club, and they go through the books that Gary Gygax had originally recommended at the back of Dungeons and Dragons, and those were books that I would have read as a teenager. So I'd read Jack Vance and Mike Moorcock and Tanith Lee and Arthur C. Clarke and all those people, and I'd just devoured enormous quantities. You know, you just read a lot more when you're younger, faster, I suppose.
Yeah.
I don't tend to read much fantasy now because it would be partly because it would be too much like the day job, and also because I like fantasy when it's good, but very often it's not very good. And so there have to be quite a few recommendations before I'll look at a fantasy or science fiction novel these days.
Right. So you touched upon Games Workshop. So how did that come about again? It was
with a friend, Nick Hentfree, who was at Christchurch. We published this game, Mortal Kombat, and schlepped around London with some copies we'd had printed, and we'd sell them to Games Centre and Games Workshop. And Workshop, I remember we went in, and the guy there, one of the Olsen brothers who used to run the shop downstairs, this was in Hammersmith, ordered something like 50 copies. And we thought, oh, wow, you know, I mean, we could almost buy a pizza as well as a beer for this. And but then when we went back, he said, oh, I spoke to Ian and Steve, and they said, we can't take 50 copies of an amateur thing like that. We'll take 10, but they do want to meet you. So we went and they were saying that they wanted to do a role-playing game that they wanted to call Adventure. I didn't think that was a great title, but you know, that was their idea, was that they could advertise it as, are you ready for adventure? And so I did quite a bit of development with that, and it didn't get wasted, as things don't, because it got recycled to some extent as Dragon Warriors a few years later. But as I say, they got the RuneQuest license, so they lost interest in doing their own role-playing game. And then so I lost touch with them for a couple of years, and then Jamie got the job as assistant editor of White Dwarf, and that brought me back into the fold, as it were.
So how did Dragon Warriors come about?
Well, that was really the direct consequence of game books, because game books became in the early 80s quite a big thing because of fighting fantasy, and every publisher wanted their own series. Some wanted more than one series, in fact. And so everyone I knew pretty much was being asked to go and see a publisher and sign up. And I went to see a company called Grafton Books, and they signed up the Golden Dragon books that Oliver Johnson and I wrote. And I thought my real interest was role-playing, and I thought of game books as a good way, as a solo springboard to role-playing. And I realized that publishers would entertain the idea of putting a role-playing game into bookshops because they were doing so well with game books. So Corgi, Transworld, were the ones in the end that I think because Oliver Johnson, who I did it with, had got a job there as an editor. So it kind of like, it made sense that he could champion it within the company. So we took Dragon Warriors to them.
That's good, and it was a complete system, wasn't it? It was a sort of, I don't want to say micro system, but I suppose it.
No, each book sort of built, which was fun to do because I didn't have to sit down and think. I mean, it's a bit haphazard because I ideally would like to work out the complete coherent GURPS style, meta system, but we didn't have the luxury for that. So I did one book that was effectively combat and general stuff, climbing ropes and so on, then a magic book, then a stealth and assassins book, and Oliver meanwhile was writing some scenarios that would go with these. So it built, each book was, I think they were 175 at the time. I don't know what that would be in today's money, but the Dungeons and Dragons books were 10 or 20 quid each. So pocket money. They were a pocket money purchase, and they were in the bookshop next to game books, so that kids who were into game books and had a few friends who would logically move on to Dragon Warriors.
Yeah. And are they being reissued? Are they still being published?
Yeah, they're now out in sort of lavish hardback. Very nice, but it's no longer it's pocket money for 40-somethings. Okay. And they were completely revamped by James Wallace about 10 years ago, and they're now published by a company called Serpent King, and they do a great job of it, and it looks really nice. And I think the PDF is even on drive-through for free, so if anyone wants to try it. The main, people say, with Dragon Warriors, the main thing is the setting, which is very British / European folkloric, low fantasy. It's quite different from the typical Dungeons and Dragons type setting, and so people who like that tend to like Dragon Warriors.
Fantastic. And so what came on after that series of books?
Well, there was Bloodsword, which was a game book set in the Dragon Warriors world, and the idea was that you could play it solo, but you could also play it with up to 3 other people by passing the book around. There would be some sections that were only for certain character classes. So you would get to see, if, for example, you had lore and somebody else didn't, you might know something about a place that they didn't know, and it would be up to you how much you wanted to tell them, that kind of thing.
That sounds like the very sort of beginning of Fable Lands. The way
it worked differently from Fable Lands in that it wasn't that same open world structure. It was still a linear quest, but a big epic quest that ran through 5 books. And you could play a team solo if you wanted to, but the ideal was that, again, I was thinking of all the routes people might take to get to full role playing. And one would be, if they'd started with game books, but nobody knew how to run a game, that in between the two would be sitting around with your friends who also like game books, playing a structured game book together, so that when you'd finish that, you might say, well, let's use Dragon Warriors and put our own games together.
Yeah. Did you kind of have a picture of your customer base at the time? It's a lot easier now because you can, you have
Yeah,
forums and groups and things.
I,
But did you know who were buying them? Did you have?
I know I'm sure that they said at the time they're mostly boys and they're mostly sort of 10 or 11 years old, that sort of thing. But I used to think, well, when I read comics as a kid, people would probably have said, well, Spider-Man's being read by 10 and 11-year-olds, but it was also being read by college kids. So I thought this could be read by anybody. So I didn't ever want to write down to them. And I was also aware that it wouldn't only be boys. Even if 90% of them were boys, that means 10% of them are girls. So you have to have a way of phrasing every, because it's second person, you always got to find a way to phrase it that doesn't assume the gender of the hero. In fact, Jamie and I have just been talking about this because in dialogue, he'd got quite a few sections in the new books we're working on where people say things like, show me this hero that you've been talking about. And he said, but should it be hero or heroine? I said, I think nowadays hero like actor could go either way, frankly, but we're quite conscious of that. I mean, it's particularly tricky where people, say you've just stolen something in Fabled Lands and there's a hue and cry. People can't say, stop him, because it might be a her. So they have to say, stop the thief or something. You have to find some way that doesn't sound like terrible dialogue, but still works for whatever gender the hero, heroine, whatever actually is.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think from doing what I do and what I can see now in the groups that play my game, certainly it is now equally male or female. And all age groups. I think probably your books as well have now spanned the age group. They've grown up with the fans, and then they're reintroduced into their children and grandchildren, and I think it's a very exciting time to be in at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So the book, going to Fable Lands now, which is probably what you're kind of most known in the gamebook community. How did that come about? I know a lot of people, I asked Jamie this last year, was like, it seems like a very complicated thing to spread it out so many books and quite a complicated process. You assured me it was easy. No, well, how do you find it? How did you come up with the idea? And
it came originally, again, because I always thought of the goal of the game books I was writing is to try to approach asymptotically the role-playing that I was doing. And in our role-playing games, the players would be typically self-starters. They would look at a map and go, there's a ruined fortress in, that borderlands, let's go there. And they'd put an expedition together and go, and all sorts of stuff would evolve. And they could go back or go in a different direction. And I would never assume that they were going to do good things. They might do bad things. So I wanted that freedom. And we had talked for quite some time about doing something like that, which we thought maybe we would use Arthurian myth, because we both loved Excalibur and Arthurian myth generally. And so we pitched that to publishers in the mid-80s, I think. And I don't think they really understood the idea of an open world and how it would all cross-connect. And insofar as they did, they probably thought we were talking about the same thing as Bloodsword. So it was only, I think, in the early 90s where a publisher at Macmillan, Mary Tapissier, actually got it, where she understood, oh, so it's really like, maybe because computer games were beginning to, I don't know if her kids or whatever had actually shown her some computer games, but the concept of being in an open world was maybe a bit clearer. So the idea in Fable Lands is you could start in any book and you can go back and forth between books. And when you get to the border between two countries, it'll say, if you want to go over the border, turn to this section in this book, in another book. And if you don't have that book, just don't cross the border yet, but so you could get involved in civil wars and to some degree change the landscape, depending on which side you took, a city might change and so on. So it was that idea of making it as much like our role-playing games as we could, really. And yeah, it was a bit complicated because Jamie would be writing one and saying, I've got this quest that connects into yours. And but we're doing the same thing now with a new series, Vulcanverse, and we'll just write a little bit to go in each other's books so that they extend across and interweave the two.
And so, and do you feel like you've got more Fable lands to bring out? Is it going to be an end, or have you?
Well, in a way, the Vulcanverse books are kind of Fable lands. We're using a system that's like Fable lands, but a bit streamlined. But the structure is exactly like Fable lands, the concepts and so on of how you go between the books. So, and there are going to be 4 of these things out this year. I've got a couple of them here right now, the proof copies.
Whoa!
I don't think that's been seen yet, actually, anywhere. But that's the proof. That's 1,700 sections long. So that's like 3 Fable Lands books, and then there's that one, which is that's about 830. So all in all, anyone's wanting Fable Lands books, there's about 3 or 4 of them going to hit in the next few weeks. In fact, those 2. So yeah, as for Fable Lands itself, I mean, people ask about that, and I think it was 25 years ago. So I'm not sure if I did a Fable Lands book now, whether they'd like it or not. You know, you feel a bit freer with a new series. You think, okay, they don't have to like it. You know, if somebody picks up Vulcanverse, you go, what's happened to his style? You know, I don't like it. There's too much dialogue or something like that. Well, that's how I write now. So if, on the other hand, a lot of Fable Lands fans say, well, we love Vulcanverse, and if you do some Fable Lands books like that, it's tricky though. I mean, you know, they say you need to have, I don't know what it is, 1,000 true fans to make these things work. And I think by true fans, they mean somebody who'll buy anything you do. And the truth is, I don't have any fans like that. I have fans who like, people who like particular series I've worked on. But if I do a comic, none of them want that comic. And if I do Can You Brexit, which was a political game book, some people will buy it, but there won't be a crossover there. Oh, cup of tea, that's really nice, thank you. So although there are, and it's great, there are these very enthusiastic Fable Lands fans, I don't think they're really numerous enough on their own to sustain more Fable Lands books. We'd have to do the writing, get the illustration done, get the covers done, do all the typesetting, the editing. It's a big, expensive process. And Vulcanverse is backed by a company which has its own online world and wants the game books as a tie-in. So then it becomes viable to do that. So in a way, we're smuggling more Fable Lands books out that way. And although I don't recommend this, I have done a conversion table. So anyone who wants to take their Fable Lands character into the Vulcanverse, even though I say that I don't think this is the right idea, I don't support it as a concept, but you can do it if you want. If your Fable Lands character is desperate for new horizons, well, you can transport them across into the Vulcanverse.
That's amazing. That sounds so cool. And where's that going to be available?
Where or when?
Where and when?
Where and when? Well, the first 2, touch wood, in the next few weeks. I mean, the proofs there are, I won't say I've spotted every mistake, but the mistakes that are left are hiding very well. And they should be out by I think the first week of September or so, and they'll be everywhere really. I mean, obviously Barnes and Noble, Amazon, but also any Waterstones, but any bookstore should be able to order them, because we've set them up not only using KDP, the Amazon's own printing arm, but those are the paperbacks, which are black and white. But we've also done full color hardback editions from Ingram Spark, which are a little bit more expensive, but they look very nice, and they should be available in any bookshop. So yeah, nobody should.
And a larger format, I see.
Well, they're the original. It's actually the original Fable Lands format. So because the original Fable Lands books were big things like that, and they actually had fold outs, but I don't know how to do those, because you could fold out the map and the character sheet from the original books.
What we've done for our ones is we've given a free link to download the map, so people can print them up themselves as big as they want.
Yeah, I think that's what we've done in those as well. Because when we republished them, and that was about 10 years ago, at that time, the only option for print on demand was the paperback sizes. So there was standard paperback. So that's why those Fablelands books are regular paperbacks. But we have since then issued them as well as large format versions.
Cool.
So people can take that choice, really.
I'm going to ask you about some of your other work. I presume these are commissioned pieces, like doing the Nightmare series.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
How did that come about? Well, because Tim Child, who was the creator and producer of Nightmare, had written a novella, and they thought, particularly because I think they were very aware then that they were quite pleased that a lot of boys played game books, because boys, 11, 12-year-olds, don't tend to read books otherwise. Certainly that was the case then. So they thought, oh, this is a way to get boys to read books. But they thought, if we put a game book bit in the back, it'll be more likely to attract them. So they first of all hired me to do a Nightmare game book that was going to go in the back of the book. But then Tim's a TV guy, so he had written the novella more like a script, lots of scene changes and so on. They said it doesn't really read like a book, it reads like a script. So, and Tim didn't have time to, it wasn't the sort of thing he would have done anyway, but he was busy making the show. So they got me in to rewrite the book as prose rather than as a script. And from then on, every time there was a new Nightmare series, they said, can you do the game book and the novella? So I ended up doing a stack of them and enjoyed them a lot, actually, because I was given a lot of freedom. You know, the backstory of Triggered, the host of the show, was that he was this Anglo-Saxon lord and so on. And I was able to fully indulge that by taking him back to the 1200s and having him involved in, you know, the Children's Crusade and stuff like that.
Oh, fantastic. That sounds great fun. What else have we done? We've got the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle series.
Yes. Well, that came about because the publisher knew that I liked comic books, and they said, do you know the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? I said, yeah. We're thinking of doing them as kids' books. Now, I said, the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle book comics were not for kids at all. They were violent and quite, you know, salacious and scary. So I said, I don't know if they're going to work for kids. Have you actually seen any of them? But they'd made the movie at the time, but they'd also made a TV show, and the TV show was a very different tone. You know, it was the Saturday morning cartoon. So they asked me to do, first of all, the movie novelization. And that was interesting because they didn't have any video cut of the movie. They just sent me the script and said, we can't get the movie in time for you, but we need it in 2.5 weeks. So could you possibly write the novelization based on the script? So I did that. And then when I finally saw the movie, I realized that they changed it quite a bit from the script I was sent. So in fact, the novelization, if anyone reads it and goes, that's not what was in the movie, it was actually the original version of the script before they changed it. So then after that, though, they said they wanted a whole bunch of, you know, tie-ins to the kids show. And so I did 6 or 8 of those things, and kind of stupidly talked myself out of a royalty because I was doing original stories, and nobody had checked that no one in America was allowed to do original stories. But somehow this loophole meant that I was just told, make up any story you like. And but then they said, do you want a royalty or a flat fee? And I don't know, I think I had bills to pay, as we often do. Yeah. So I'll take the flat fee because it's more guaranteed. And then, of course, they sold, I don't know, 250,000, 500,000 copies each. And I was thinking, maybe a royalty would have been a better idea, especially as they were then able to use the characters I created in the original TV show. So never mind, you live and learn.
Yes, hey ho, hey ho. Now, I've got some questions for you from the community. So this is from Jam. Now, you've done many game books in many series. Which of your books was the most exhilarating to write and your personal favourite?
Well, gosh, you know, it's whichever one you're working on, you've got to love it at the time. So you know, which one? The thing is, when you're writing them, I suppose the main thing is you don't know how it's going to turn out. You know, like people say they can enjoy making a movie, but sometimes that movie is terrible. So, in fact, I think it was David Mamet saying you're just really lucky if you enjoy making the movie and it ends up being a good movie. That's just fantastic. So, I think the ones that when they're finished, I was most happy with, like, yeah, that would be one that I would hold up and say, yeah, see that worked out. Would be Heart of Ice, which was one I intended to write for years because it was based on a role-playing campaign that I'd run, and I ended up changing a lot of the setting and everything for the sake of the book. But it kind of everything fell into place. Maybe partly because a lot of the characters were very developed as player characters. So although they were different for the sake of the story, they had enough of the traits of the people I knew that they felt very alive, and people say that they feel that in the book. So I think that helped. The middle two Bloodsword books, for similar reasons, because a lot of my player characters kind of appear as background characters in there. So that would be the Demon's Claw and Doomwalk, I think were pretty successful in terms of what I wanted to achieve with them. I liked doing Down Among the Dead Men because it was a pirate book, so it gave me an excuse to watch lots and lots of great pirate movies, which I enjoyed. And putting fantasy and magic into a pirate setting was a new idea that had not been done anywhere. And so, yeah, that was a really good one.
A very similar question, actually. You might have the same answer, but is there any book that maybe didn't do as well commercially that you kind of felt should have done? Because
I mean, there's two. Yeah, okay. So there's two questions there in a way, because didn't do as well as I'd wanted. I mean, I'm thinking first of all, am I creatively happy with it? And I think the last of the virtual reality books I did, that was called Twist of Fate, and I later released it as Once Upon a Time in Arabia. And I was trying to do a very picaresque, goes anywhere kind of Arabian Nights-y thing, and I think it ended up directionless. And I tried to fix that with the new edition by giving more of a purpose in the introduction to what the player character is trying to achieve. But I still think that wasn't it. Compared to the other books that I did in that series, it doesn't really measure up. Commercially, I think the biggest disappointment was Can You Brexit? Because I thought this is such a complex issue that it should really be handled as a game book. That's the best way to understand something, to get hands-on. And then I thought, who would write it? I suppose it would have to be me. And I didn't really want to, and I had plenty of other things to get on with. But I was interested by the technical issue of how to build, because you had time passing, and I was going to divide it into 4 6-month sections of the point of declaring Article 50 to actually leaving the EU. And I realized that many of the topics you'd have to deal with, you might want to deal with at the start or later. So how would I deal with the fact that I didn't want to rewrite the same chunk of sections over and over again? So I had to figure out a way to put that into print, as it were. Computers obviously would deal with it easily. But when I figured that out, that was what I really wanted to do, is just figure out how to do it. I didn't want to actually have to research it all, which took about a year, but I did. And my agent kept saying, a lot of publishers are really very interested in this. So I did it. And then the publishers, I think it was just before that Christmas, which must have been 2017, loads of publishers came back saying, we really want to do this. This is such a great idea. They all go off then to their publishing committees, and you have 15 parasites in a room. Anyway, somebody will say something like, well, I think it's a very daring move, you championing this book, but it's your career. What they mean is, I've got my stiletto ready, and if this fails, so of course the end result of publishing committees is that nobody really wants to make a bold decision. So all these editors came back going, oh, well, I liked it, but nobody else in the room liked it. And there was somebody, I think in one case, the people on the publishing committee somebody had said, "Oh, I think it's something only boys would like." It's like, that was the 1980s. This is ridiculous. But anyway, then even more annoyingly, I have a friend who's a bookseller, and he put it on sale. He was actually, I think he retired recently, but he put it on sale in his bookshop, and he sold about 100 copies, and to all sorts of people as well. You know, one of them was a local Tory councillor who was very pro-Brexit and came in and thought it was a great idea to have a book about it, and bought the book and got a lot of good feedback. And if you can sell 100 copies from one shop, you think, well, if only I'd got that into every bookshop in the country, you know. At which point, a lot of those editors came back and said to my agent, "Oh, you know what, we should have done the book. We thought it was all going to be over immediately, and it's dragged on." So, you know, that's why I use the term parasite, because really they could have done something interesting, but they didn't. And I think that could have sold a lot of copies. And since it took me a year to research and write it, I would have liked to have sold a few more copies of it.
Yeah, well. That's frustrating. Now, David Gottery says, if someone's new to your books, where should they start? And why there?
Well, that depends on what they like, really, doesn't it? If you like role-playing, you could take a look at Dragon Warriors. I suppose if you're going to look at, if you like simple, like not too much in the way of rules mechanics, I would go for the Critical If books, which are things like Heart of Ice, Necklace of Skulls, Down Among the Dead Men, because there are no dice involved. You just pick your skills. You pick 4 skills out of a list of 12, I think, and that really informs, you know, what kind of an adventure you're going to have. If you like lots of tactical choice, then Bloodsword, and a big epic high fantasy-ish thing, that would be Bloodsword. Obviously, currently, because I'm just writing the Vulcanverse books are my current squeeze, and so that would be the one I would go, yeah, well, start with Vulcanverse because I've just done it.
Good idea.
If on the other hand, if they wanted to go out, my favorite of all my work isn't game related at all. It's my comic book Mirabilis, and I think most of the issues I did are actually free online on the website mirabilisyearofwonders.com. So if anyone wants to take a look at those, they can.
Fantastic. Now, Paul Partington says, which is your favorite illustration? Ooh. Not counting maps. There's a caveat to it.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's very hard to say. There's a great, what immediately leapt to mind is there's a great picture that Russ Nicholson did in one of the Fabled Lands books, which is a bunch of skeletons pressing their faces up to the window of a ship that you're on, which is sort of funny and really spooky and brilliantly done. I mean, it's beautiful. If it were on the wall, you know, I would love to have the original. And several of Russ's, actually. I mean, the ones he's done in Dragon Warriors, I do have a couple of originals of those. And Jamie's got a couple of, I think one of Russ's from one of my Golden Dragon books, funnily enough, on his wall. There are there's one that Leo Hartas did, which was the original inspiration for, there's a bridge in Dragon Warriors called the Rathabosk Bridge, which spans a huge chasm, and it's a city on a bridge, really, covered with buildings. And that comes from an illustration that Leo did when I think he was about 18, and he showed me this picture of this incredible fantasy bridge, and I said, well, I've got to put it into Dragon Warriors, and that's a beautiful thing as well. So yeah, it's too, there are so many illustrations, and there's usually, I've been very lucky, got great illustrators, and they've done their best work in books that I've worked on. So I would be spoilt for choice, really.
Who's doing the illustrations in your current books?
Okay. Well, the covers there I was showing you are by Mattia Simone, who did the cover for the Italian edition of Heart of Ice, which is really good, nice cover. And some of the interior illustrations by him, and I think some of them are taken from, because Vulcanverse is this online game with NFTs, and there's a card game, and I don't really know all the details because it's Jamie's thing, but they have a team of artists, and some of those pictures are taken from the card illustrations. It's a bit like magic, I guess, something like that. So, but Mattia Simone is the lead artist, as it were, on the books.
Fantastic. Now, Paul Smith says, I don't think this is a criticism at all. I think it's just a creative question.
Okay.
If you were to rewrite Fable Lands series from scratch, what would you do differently?
Well, I'll take out some of the logic loops to let you just mine gold for a start, which crept by. It is an interesting. There's also the problem that I think because it wasn't an open-ended system, in that you can get to the point where you may not be able to hit a monster or vice versa. And in fact, I introduced a kind of house rule, which is you at any point can, because you normally roll 2 dice and add your skills to it. Right? So at any point you can choose to roll 3 dice instead, but the adversary gets the same option. So in effect, you're telegraphing your blows, but you're making it easier for them to hit you. So that should fix that, but it shouldn't have been a problem in the first place. I just think we had never considered the massively escalating power levels that you get by the time you got to book 7, for example. So you've always got to consider that when when you start book 1. Don't just think, what's this first rank character like? But you've got to think, what's the 15th rank character going to be like? And there's also the question of the complexity of rules, because there's the choice of, you see some modern game books have extremely arithmetically based systems where you have lots and lots of options of adding different tactical numbers. And I'm quite conscious that when role-playing, often players have said to me, my wife said, for example, the more it's about numbers, the less I really can relate to it. So I've tended to move away from that if possible. So that's why the Vulcanverse books are much simpler. And I guess my preference would be to do things like I did a game book version of Frankenstein that was just on iPhone and iPad, and that's got no numbers, obviously, because they're all under the hood. And the Brexit book doesn't use numbers or just percentages, but it's very simple. So my personal preference would be to make everything really simple, but I know that there are 2 different schools of thought with game book fans now. Some would go, like looking at something like Albert, that looks like it's all about the story, and I like that. But then there's also things like Legendary Kingdoms, which has gone far more complex than Fabled Lands ever was.
Yeah. I think it really depends on your audience, isn't it? You're going to get some who are really, but if they're being sold in bookshops, and someone picks it up, I'm going to buy this for my son or granddaughter, or they won't. They'll see the rules and they'll put them off.
Well, and also, I guess my feeling is if you're going to make it tactically very involved, you might as well be playing a war game or a board game. If you're sitting reading a story, I don't. If I'm watching a movie, I don't want stats to be coming up. He's now 80% annoyed, and you don't want any of that. So, my feeling would be in game books, it's more of a book than a game.
Yeah, agreed. Right, now I've got a few questions. I think we've answered some of these already from James Arcott. But one question he had about the last book that you did for the Nightmare series.
Okay.
He said it was different. It's a puzzle book interwoven with a novel aspect. Now, it sounded like there were a bit of both, but was it written kind of differently? Did you have sort of...
Yes, they decided, I don't know who makes these decisions, but they decided that they wanted to target a younger audience. And maybe I think Nightmare had a relatively broad, maybe 7 to 11 or 12 maybe, but they didn't figure that the 11 or 12-year-olds were going to be buying the books. So they wanted me to take it much younger, put lots of puzzles in, and the narrative simply became a sort of, it's just a sort of excuse for the puzzles. I think I smuggled more of a narrative in than they wanted, because I thought the stories were the interesting thing, and I hate puzzles and riddles and stuff. So, but anyway, that's what they asked for, so that's what I did.
Cool. Okay, now Rob Carew, he wants to talk about Vulcanverse, which is good. Any new mechanics? I think you mentioned there were a few, but any background to the world we can expect for those who haven't played the game?
Well, Jamie's the one to ask about this because it's his world. my understanding of it, which might not be right, but it's the version in my books anyway, is that Vulcan has created this. This is the explanation of the online world, that Vulcan has created a world for people to, basically like a Minecraft-y type world that people can buy territory in and do stuff. And in the books, I've just taken that as this is a sort of artificial universe that the people in it think is the real world. So they don't sit there going, oh, it's a computed world or anything. You know, clearly it's kind of vaguely Greco-Roman, mythological. I suppose the nearest connection for me would be something like the dreaming in Sandman. It's a dreaming of, it's the Greek imaginary, basically. It's not ancient Greece, but it has a feel of that. That's how you'd style it. You know, it's Clash of the Titans rather than Lord of the Rings. And the mechanics of Fableland's stripped down, really. Like you don't have hit points. You're either wounded, dead, or you're okay, basically. So when you get wounded, try to get unwounded as quickly as possible, because it could be nasty if you've got another wound. That's really quite simple. And I've done a lot more with having companions. So you can meet different characters and they have very different personalities, and the things that they'll help you to do or suggest will be quite different as you're traveling around. And mainly I did that because I'd rather have dialogue than, you know, you get to the point where you really don't want to have to keep writing, you cross the room and open the window or something like that. When it's in dialogue, you can do it with a bit more style and variety. So I wanted something I'd just happened upon in, I think, Down Among the Dead Men, where you're escaping from a pirate ship and you end up with a few companions. I thought, this is a great opportunity for me to have some character interplay and development. And so you can pick up different companions, as I say, in the Vulcanverse as you go around. And that's the major difference from Fabled Lands.
Fantastic. Let's see. Gamero called Ferrari says, I would ask him if he would republish or even self-publish on Amazon the old books that are not easy to find.
Every single book of mine is available on Amazon. So yeah, your wish is my command there.
Yes. Okay, right. Louise Lee would love to know how he first got involved with game books. I think we've answered that quite thoroughly. Darcy Byron, are his new books out? Well, no,
very soon.
Very soon.
Yeah.
By the time this comes out,
take a breath, and it'll be there.
He told me I could buy at any bookstore. Okay. Well, that's the thing. Are they in the bookstores? If they're on Amazon, but are they?
Well, in theory, you could go to Waterstones, or you could go to any bookstore ought to be able to order them. I mean, you can go in and give them the ISBN. Go to Amazon, get the ISBN, go into the bookstore, say, get me this book, here's the ISBN. They ought to be able to order it.
Yes.
If it's a good bookstore. If it isn't, if they won't do it, change your bookstore.
And you can always say, and all my friends want a copy as well. Get as many as you can in.
Yeah, tell them to order 10 while they're at it. Cheaper.
Okay, Victor, I do apologize to get your own Antanazov.
Tanazov?
That's the one. Now, he asks if paper game book nowadays, although evolved from their past selves, are going to remain a mostly boutique self-published initiative, or do they have a place in the ranks of the casual reader?
Well, that's a good question, because clearly, and Victor actually is the genius behind the Fabled Lands CRPG that's currently out, and you can get it on Steam, and it's got 20,000 people on its wish list, so it's doing quite well, I think. And that's gorgeous. It looks lovely, and it's clearly, when you're scooting around doing an adventure, it does all the heavy lifting for you, which is also what my Frankenstein on iPad had, that advantage that you don't have to sit and roll any dice and note any numbers down. It's all being handled for you. That also gave me the opportunity with Frankenstein to put lots and lots of conditional text. So early on in the story, your reaction to the monster determines whether it's referred to as it or he for the rest of the book. And In a game book, clearly that would be impossible, but in the iPad version, it simply remembers, and it changes the whole way you feel about the creature for the rest of the story, depending on whether you've humanized it or not. So you can do a lot more that way, I think. But having said that, I did try reading books on Kindle for a while, and if I'm going on holiday, I guess it makes sense, but I tend to prefer to have a paper book in front of me, just because you can flip through and find where you were before more easily, and just lots of things. So I think people who like books, maybe we're going to die out, but while we're still around, maybe they will prefer old style game. It's going to shape what you put in the game book. That's why I say I think something like Alba looks like a good use of a book, because it's primarily about the story. But if you're going to make it very gamey, like if I was doing Bloodsword now, there would be no sense in making that a print book. It needs to be a CRPG, really.
Cool. Okay. Ian Berger says, this is very niche, this one. Ask him what he based his armor bypass roll on in the Dragon Warriors. I've been researching penetration tests and is generally interested.
Okay. Well, it was everybody at the time would, you either had armor class rolls or whatever they were to hit rolls in D&D, or a lot of systems like GURPS and RuneQuest had armor absorption. So they would just soak up some of the damage from a blow. And there's some logic behind that in that, you're absorbing kinetic energy. But I thought, then you can get into the detail of, well, some things are better, like chainmail is good against an edged weapon. It's not very good against a blunt weapon and all that kind of palaver. And I didn't want to get that involved. And also, there are cases in history, I think at the Battle of Lincoln, where I've forgotten who it was, but one of the lords, they just couldn't injure him with swords or anything. It had to be held down, and somebody had to find the equivalent of a screwdriver through the visor to deal with this guy. So I thought, armor bypass is a way of letting me say a sword blow would be really nasty. You're not going to get a 1-point scratch, really. If you get hit by a sword, it's pretty bad. Right. But your armor might just glance off. So it's an attempt to do the glancing off effect rather than use armor absorption, which seems a bit too precise in a way. There's a bit more luck in the armor bypass roll.
Fantastic. Right. Okay. We got Ian Berger. Based on the success of Walls of is it Spiter?
Mm-hmm.
Kickstarter, would he consider releasing any of his other works as hardcovers?
Well, we're going to try it with the Vulcanverse books, and I guess that will be an experiment, because you've got the hardbacks, full color, or the paperbacks, which are black and white. I'll be interested. It was mainly that Mattia's paintings he did some thumbnails before he did the final paintings, and they were all different and brilliant. It was like all of he's like Johnny Hodgson, that even a sketch is fantastically evocative. And I thought, we've got to use them somehow. So I thought I'll put them in because you need fillers in game books, right? Because you can't, what you must never have is one option pokes over to the next page and people don't realize, they never get to see it. So you have to use fillers to push the text, so you always see all the options you've got. So it's a formatting thing. Yeah. So I had to have some artwork for that, and I was putting Mattia's stuff in, and then I realized as I was doing the black and white versions, they just look so, it would be a shame not to have a color version. And it's only, an extra few days work for me to set them up on Ingram Spark as well. Yeah. And I know that some people do like to have a sort of, a keeper, something to put on the shelf and really feel I don't have to touch it. You just look in it occasionally, and they can always get the paperback and rip that apart and write all the way through it. The hardback could be, if they want to have a collector's item, they could just put that on the shelf. So it'll be interesting to see how many people pick that option.
Fantastic. Right. Now we've got I've got a few people who keep asking the same question. So Marcus Cole says, will we ever see the production of the last book for Fabled Lands?
The last book? Well, we'd have to do a few to get to the last book, I guess. Paul Gresty, who wrote book 7, is writing book 8, I think just as a labor of love, which, God bless him. And I often thought, as I say, it would be, people might think it just doesn't really fit if I wrote one now. I don't know. I think You know, because like if Jamie wrote one now, he's written things like the Dark Lord book. So he'd probably, like, his Vulcanverse book is much more comedic than the Fable Lands books were. And my book is different. I mean, it's hard to judge my own, but mine is different from my Fable Lands book. So one thing I thought was if we could get a kind of super group approach of a bunch of writers who would all agree, we'll do a Fabled Lands book. So you know you're not getting the original Rolling Stones, but you're getting the new lineup, each doing a book, and it would be interesting to compare them. But how would we fund it? There aren't enough Fabled Lands fans, I suspect, to make.
How do they sell in around the world? Have they been translated?
Yes, actually, they do a lot better in Italian, German, and French than they really do in English. I think there seems to be particularly in Italy, quite a vibrant game book community still. I mean, there may very well be in English too. I mean, there are Kickstarters that make tons of money, but I don't know what they're doing that makes that work. But our experience is that those Fabled Lands books, maybe the people who didn't get a chance to play them before can now get them. So we're selling more in, say, in Italy, because they're filling up a collection that they couldn't have done back in the 90s. I don't think there was an Italian edition then. And Heart of Ice is particularly popular, it seems, through Russia. I don't get any money for it. I think it's a fan thing, but it's good to know. There's this point where you're just happy that somebody's enjoying your work. And there's a new Polish edition coming out quite soon as well. And I guess around the world, maybe more than there is in the English language, partly also because a lot of British game books never really cracked the American market. You know, American game books tend to be choose your own adventure type stuff more. The rules-based stuff didn't used to happen. Now, it might be that more American gamers got into Dungeons and Dragons quicker, so they weren't playing heavily rule-based game books. But certainly my books and most of our books that were published in the 80s in America didn't do anything like as well there as they would have done in Britain and France and so on. Again, we'll have to see how something like Vulcanverse does, but we definitely we have relationships with Italian, French, and German publishers. So we're planning that if they want to do editions, then they should be available in those countries as well.
I think it's just seeing what the demand is, and some of these things have a habit of having a resurgence years later, don't they? A bit of nostalgia kicking in. Okay, now we've got Renee Batsford is saying, how did you come up with the innovation system for Fabled Lands?
The innovation system?
So innovative. I think we talked about this. No, I think we talked about it earlier. So, Campbell Petney. So, Dave, remember the special mini game book you said you'd write for us in Christmas to help us escape book 12 if we fall into it?
I vaguely remember that. And my only excuse is that, this year I've had to write about 250,000 words of Vulcanverse, and it's not over yet. So it might be another Christmas. It's interesting because somebody was saying that they felt that to really make a go of writing, you had to be able to write 1 million words a year. And I just think I'd give up. I'd become a plumber if that was the only, because 250,000 is quite enough, I think. And I'm already getting to the point where I'm kind of word blind from it. You get to the point where you can't use words anymore. And I'm actually finding that even when I'm talking to people, my normally extensive vocabulary is crumbling because I've used all the words too many times.
I'm going to ask you a question actually, as a writer as well. What is your process? How did you, do you write a certain amount of hours a day? Do you have to close yourself off? I
think it just depends on the kind of thing. I mean, if it's a linear story, like a comic, for example, where there's no game book dimension, it would involve a lot of walking while I was, conjuring the story. And then usually I can sort of put it down in rough form and move bits around. And again, one of the reasons I like comics is because I thumbnail everything, and then I can decide, I know what the story is as a silent movie, as it were. Then I can put in the dialogue, and the original version of the dialogue will be very clunky, and then I can finesse the dialogue to make it right. With game books, there's not so much of that, because kind of ironically, because you've got several different branches, it means I don't have to hone everything perfectly. I think, well, one of these stories will be better than another one, but people have different tastes, so I don't feel so bothered about getting it right, as it were. That one of them will be right for different people, so one of those branches. So my process on the game books on the whole has been, I'll have a bit of an idea, I think Terry Pratchett talked about looking out he imagined looking out across a canyon with fog in it. Then you can see a few places where if you were going to build a bridge, that's where you'd put it to. But then you've got to think, okay, I know what all of those posts are, but I can't see the rest of it because of the fog. So I've got to find my way. So I'll know there's going to be a bit when you go to the city of the Spartoi or something like that. But I haven't, until I get there, I only have the vaguest idea what it's going to be.
Do you have, when you're writing it, obviously the player will be there, an adventurer, and do you have your own adventurer in your head that you are taking on the journey as you write, someone in your mind's eye? You say, I'm always playing this kind of,
I think probably not, because I like to have, it's nice to have that, but that's what I've used the companions for, because I know their personalities. But I think was it J.K. Rowling said, Harry isn't supposed to be the most popular character. He's the everyman that you project onto. So he's actually a weaker character in terms of how he's defined than Ron and Hermione and so on. Yeah. And so I've used the companions as the characters who have their own voice and so on. And it's actually, I'm always worried when I even say something like, you are alarmed, because I think, how do I know you're alarmed? Maybe you're not. Maybe you think, well, I laugh in the face of danger. So I don't like to presuppose. It's not just gender, it's anything about the character. I think it should be entirely for the player, really, to decide that. That would be the ideal. But I think the other thing is, because I've done a lot of running role-playing games, I'm quite used to winging it. So when it comes to doing game books, I tend to sort of go into that sort of mode and not really mind that I haven't got a plan in detail. In fact, Jamie was a little bit horrified that I often don't bother to flowchart until after I've done the book. Yeah. So I'm just flowcharting in my head, and I think, well, there might be a missing bit, but I'll catch it when I edit. So it doesn't really matter. Whereas once upon a time, like Bloodsword, I would meticulously flowchart the whole book, writing almost the complete text in tiny little writing. And then it was just a question of typing the book up. But now I go straight to Word, write the book, and the flowchart sort of follows on. Or sometimes there are bits of flowcharts, but I rarely bother with the whole thing until the end.
How long does it normally take you to write a book then?
Well, it used to be quicker. And these two, I've been on, I think we started them in November, but then there was Christmas. And I have been editing for the last 6 weeks or so. Basically, about 4 months per book, I think. But as I say, the first one I did because I'd lost the knack of being brief and keeping in mind how long the Fablelands books were all about 750 sections, and then my book here, The Hammer of the Sun, turned out to be 1706 sections. It was supposed to be 750, and the new one I'm writing, The Pillars of the Sky, which is book 4 in the series, I thought, right, I'll make this one 750 sections, and it's already 1,000, and I haven't been able to land it yet. So that's a knack of maybe I'm not as disciplined or something.
Yeah, but you're going to create something unique. Well, it sounds like it's going to be a whole different.
Yeah, I mean, I don't suppose anyone will complain that they're getting plenty of adventure.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I thank you so much for your time, Dave. It's been fantastic.
It's a pleasure.
Talking to you. And if anyone needs to sort of find out about you, is there a particular website that they should go to, or just crawl around on Amazon buying all your books?
Yeah, I think there's the Fablelands blog I often go to. I've got a Patreon page, Jewel Spider, which is for my role-playing game. That's my actual passion project, but it's been edged out for the last few months by the need to make some money.
Well, do you want to
and
tell us a little bit more about your passion project then?
well, it's set in the same world as Dragon Warriors. It's just more of an exploration of the folkloric stuff. It's much more streamlined because I just wanted a role-playing game where the rules don't get in the way of you just making stories up, as it were. So people sometimes say, are you a simulationist or a narrativist? Because that's the current thing. You've got to be one or the other. And I have liked, I ran a game of Sagas of the Icelanders, which is a Powered by the Apocalypse game. And I did like the fact that you could just get on with it. And there was none of that. Nobody ever needed to get the book and look up, what maneuver, like we often use GURPS, and there are so many maneuvers and you've got to keep looking at the book. So I wanted to get something that had the ability of a simulationist system to simply generate narrative without presupposition, because I don't like players having to think about where the story is going to go. I want it to happen. But at the same time, I didn't want them to have to keep referring to rules and it becomes a war game. So Jewel Spider is that. And people say, is it a new edition of Dragon Warriors? Which it isn't really. It's set in that world, but it's much more like a realistic version of that world. It's low fantasy and it uses a lot of the folkloric magic and the sense of what a sorcerer or whatever would actually be like, which the whole idea of the Dragon Warriors world is it's pretty much the medieval world as people in the Middle Ages thought it was. Yeah. So if they think there are goblins on the moors and they're scary, they really are scary and a bit undefined and mysterious. And so it's got lots of that feel to it. I should be glad to, I've enjoyed doing the Vulcanverse books, but I'd be very glad to get back to Jewel Spider, which I really, really, really need to get. I have done a version 0, but I want to get the magic system ready for Christmas so that people over Christmas can play it. The people on the Patreon can play it. And so yes, there's the Fablelands blog, there's my Patreon page, and there's also, I mentioned Mirabilis Year of Wonders, which is my comic, which is all online and people can go and read that. Anyway, it's hard to miss me on the internet, basically.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Dave. So go and check him out and go and support him on Patreon and let's see that RPG in reality next year and fully supported. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thanks, Ollie.
I'm going to stop recording now.